Hey guys, it's Miss Vinson. Today we're going to talk about a topic called price elasticity of demand. What we're trying to figure out now is the strength of consumers' response to a change in price. In other words, when things get more expensive, we know people are going to buy less, but how much less? Now in this unit, we're going to end up using the words elastic and inelastic very often to describe consumers' behavior and to describe demand. So let me give you some concrete examples that you can refer back to just to give you a point of reference. This rubber band could definitely be classified as something that is elastic. And the reason why it could be classified as being elastic is because it doesn't take much force to get a big response out of this rubber band. So when we talk about people's reaction being elastic, we mean that consumers are having a really strong response. This is probably not the most elastic thing that you've seen in your life. That's because even if I put a lot of force on it, I'm not going to get a very big response out of it. So when we say that consumers' demand is inelastic for something, we mean that they're not really going to change how much they're buying whenever the price of that item changes. All right, let's work with a couple of examples to illustrate it. First off, suppose the price of Starbucks coffee goes up 10%. How strong are people going to react to that 10% price hike? Well, suppose people reacted by buying 30% less. It definitely sounds like a pretty big reaction. Here's what we're going to do with these numbers. We're going to divide them. Always remember, guys, the thing that changed first goes on the bottom, and the reaction always goes on top. So what we're going to have is negative 30% divided by a positive 10%. Now when we divide these numbers out, we're going to get a negative 3. First off, the negative we don't even really care about because it doesn't tell us anything that we didn't already know. All that negative sign tells us is that price on the bottom and quantity demanded on top are inversely related. So we're going to get rid of it. Now the easiest way to get rid of that negative sign is just to do absolute value, and what we're really left with is the number 3. This number is called our elasticity coefficient. Now, this number doesn't really mean anything to you unless you have the scale to judge it by. So here's the scale. If your elasticity coefficient is greater than 1, then that means that demand is elastic over that price range. So the bigger the elasticity coefficient, the bigger consumers' response, the more elastic the demand. If your elasticity coefficient ends up being less than 1, maybe it's a 0.4 or a 0.78, then that means that your consumers had a weak response. That means that demand is inelastic. Finally, if your elasticity coefficient is exactly 1, then that means that demand is considered unitary or unit elastic over that price range. Now, unitary means that people didn't respond stronger than the price change or weaker than the price change. They had a reaction that exactly matched the price change. So in this next example, suppose that the price of toilet paper goes up 20%. People are going to buy less, but they really can't buy that much less, right? I mean, toilet paper is a necessity. So if the price of toilet paper goes up 20%, suppose the quantity demanded of toilet paper only goes down by 8%. So for our problem, we're going to have a positive 20 in the bottom and a negative 8 in the top. Well, what you're going to end up with there is a negative 0.4. So we're going to do the absolute value and we're going to just pay attention to the number. Well, that is less than 1, which means that people's demand for toilet paper is inelastic in this price range. Now let's give a unitary example. Suppose that the price of blankets goes down 25%. Since we want this example to be unitary, we have to have consumers' reaction exactly match the price change. So if the price of blankets went down 25%, then people are going to react by buying exactly 25% more. So whenever we do this division, we're going to get a negative 1. Remember, we don't care about the negative sign right now. We're just going to take absolute value. So our elasticity coefficient in this example is just going to be a 1. Now, when you think about unitary or unit elastic, price and quantity demanded are kind of moving together as a unit. So you can think about that when you're thinking about unitary. Let's take this stuff and try to graph it. Let's talk about our elastic example. Let's go back to our Starbucks coffee example. On your graph, you're going to draw a downward sloping demand curve, but before you draw it like you normally do, try to take and make it a little bit flatter. Now that Starbucks coffee has gone up 10%, people are buying 30% less. A small increase on the y-axis led to a very large reaction on your x-axis. So the flatter the demand curve, the more elastic the demand. In the case of an inelastic demand, instead of going flatter, our curve is going to be steeper. So let's go back to our example with toilet paper. So a 20% increase in price only elicited an 8% response on the x-axis. So we moved a lot on the y-axis, but hardly any on the x-axis. So the steeper your demand curve, the more inelastic people's demand. What would unitary look like on a graph? Unitary would be more like your standard downward sloping demand curve that we've been drawing, which is approximately 45 degrees. Now, are you ready to go crazy? Because we're about to take these to their extremes. Okay guys, we said that a flatter demand curve tends to be more elastic. So what if we had a perfectly flat demand curve? I'm talking horizontal. That would be perfectly elastic demand. Now this is one of our theoretical extremes, but in this example, what we have is an infinite amount of people want to buy this item at a particular price. But what happens if you increase your price? Well, if we go to a higher price range on this graph, we're completely off the demand curve. Basically though, at one particular price, the quantity demanded is infinite, but if you change that price ever so slightly, then you end up losing all your customers. Now that is a super strong response by customers, and that is a perfectly elastic demand. Here, your elasticity coefficient would actually be infinity. What if we took our steep demand curve that was inelastic and we made it perfectly steep? Well, that would mean it would be perfectly inelastic. So a perfectly inelastic demand is zero response. So we're going to have a vertical demand curve on this graph. Suppose that at a price of $10, people are buying 50 items. All right, well, if the price doubles and goes up to $20, hit the demand curve, people are still buying 50 items. I mean, what's going on? It's like these customers don't even realize that the price is changing. These people are having no response to the price change at all whatsoever. So this is zero response by customers. Your elasticity coefficient in this case would be 0. This isn't when things are just necessities like toilet paper. This is when things are like life or death necessities, maybe like insulin for diabetics. You need a certain amount no matter what the price is. That is a perfectly inelastic demand for something. So very quickly, let's talk about a couple of factors that would affect whether or not people are going to have a strong reaction or a weak reaction to the price change in something. First off, if the item is a luxury or a necessity, that can make a big difference in how strong people react whenever the price changes. Starbucks coffee? All right, well, Starbucks coffee is more of a luxury item, right? We don't have to have it. And so if the price of Starbucks coffee goes up, most of us can have a strong reaction and say, oh, I don't really have to buy that. I've got so many other things to choose from. But think about toilet paper. When the price of toilet paper went up, toilet paper was a necessity. So people wish they could say, I don't need to buy toilet paper anymore, but they can't because it's a necessity. Next is how many substitutes are available. If there's many other things you can use in place, then you're going to have a strong reaction and quit buying that expensive thing. But yet think about toilet paper. There's not a lot of great substitutes for toilet paper, right? So you're sort of stuck having to buy that item. Another factor that can affect elasticity is how broad or specific of an item we're talking about. So how broad or narrow is our definition of the market? Now, a narrow definition of the market is something very specific. It's not just food, it's not just dessert, it's not just ice cream, it's not just mint chocolate chip ice cream, which is the best, it's Brewster's mint chocolate chip ice cream. That is a very narrow definition of the market, a very specific item. So when you have a narrow definition of the market, your demand is going to be more elastic. If Brewster's mint chocolate chip ice cream gets really expensive, then I have a lot of other things I can use in place of that. I could choose a different flavor, or I could choose a different brand. If we're talking about a broad definition of the market, then we're talking about things that are general categories like food or clothing or transportation. When we start talking about those big categories, those things tend to be more necessities. So if the general price level of clothing goes up, we wish we could have a strong response and say, man, forget clothes. No, we don't really wish that. But we can't have a strong reaction because clothes are a necessity. Finally, something else that can affect elasticity is the amount of time you have to adjust to a price change. Suppose the price of gasoline goes up to $10 a gallon tomorrow. We have places we need to be, so if the price of gas goes up to $10 a gallon, we hate it. Most of us in the short run, without a lot of time to adjust to that high price, we're going to be stuck having to buy another tank of gas. But what if you give us a year to adjust to that high gas price? Now, if you give people a year to adjust to that high gas price, I guarantee you they're going to have a strong reaction and people are going to buy significantly less amounts of gas because they're going to work out ways around having to buy gas. They're going to save up money and more people are going to purchase electric vehicles. So the more time people have to adjust to a price change, the stronger the reaction they have because they can work out alternatives, they can work out other substitutes.